I went straight into sharing my memories, wasting no time. My mother was mobile as a single mother, with my two sisters and me. There were times we lived in her car for weeks at a time, and there were numerous overnight car sleeps when we traveled long distances. And when the car broke down, things were especially difficult. Trying to find a mechanic that would work with little or no profit on a car that little kids and a single mom needed at night to sleep in, and staying away during the day when the mechanic might work on the car. Not easy. I wondered sometimes how many times my mother convinced these mechanics to take on such extraordinary extra work. I hope it was simply that they took pity on her, and that she did not have to offer any services for them to help. I shudder to think of what my mother has had to do, albeit as a result of her life choices. There were times that we had stayed with people that my mother had barely met, or somehow knew from some past life with my father, Silver, before they were separated. As a tiny person, a toddler, my mother had me sleep in a dresser drawer as a crib or a bed. Drawers were safe from animals and unknown environments. And most everyone had a dresser with a crib drawer. She should just ask them, and I had a crib. Honestly, even as a toddler, I liked sleeping in long drawers because I was surrounded on all sides with a wall, and I was in like an armored furniture tank. Bluntly, sleeping in a drawer was no big deal, as long as you fit inside it. In retrospect, even though I was fine with our nomadic lifestyle, I wonder if that uncertainty and worry may have had some deep-rooted effect on me now, later in life. Not only had we lived in a car sporadically when traveling in Mexico, but we also lived in the car within the United States. I recall an extreme incident while my mother, sisters, and I were living in her station wagon, car as it was, following my mother's fleeing from my father. My mother did not want to accept her mistakes and return to live with her own parents, and so decided instead living in a car with her 3 children was preferable. Yeah, my mother made irrational and highly emotional and sometimes destructive decisions. Despite her reticence, my mother ultimately acquiesced and moved in with her parents while she got back on her feet. We suffered living in a car for a few weeks unnecessarily because of my mother's pride. At one point, when our gas tank was running critically low, my mother pulled into a gas station with that station wagon. She got out to pump the fuel, as usual, but worried if she had enough money to cover the gasoline. She had to be very careful not to overpump and be cash short. She had barely lifted the pump handle when the gas station attendant came running out screaming, No, don't use the pump. Do not use the pump. Stop. Do not use the pump. No gas, no gas. He was panicked. The attendant was so afraid as he ran towards my mother, who looked quite confused, and she proceeded to ignore him and remove the gas cap as she would shortly get the pump dispensing fuel into the car. The attendant exclaimed further as my mother now had the nozzle in her hand. Fire, fire, your car is on fire. Stop, we'll die. Blow it up, stop. Well, it turned out my mother's car was on fire. In a very big way, it was on fire. Something apparently had given away inside the engine compartment, presumably a fuel line. Fuel had released on the hot engine as my mother pulled into the gas station, whereupon it ignited and was burning fuel all over the engine. And her engine was remarkably unmaintained, with unclean oil and gunk all over it, which easily spanned and spread the flames everywhere, all over the hood and outside it. There was a lot of gasoline and oil gunk all over now to fuel the fire, and it was getting very big amazingly fast. It was remarkable timing for the car to break a fuel line and spray gasoline all over the engine right as we pulled into a gas station. There was danger for the gas station exploding itself if the pump nozzle ignited and that spread to the underground mammoth fuel tanks of the station. It was very real and very scary, and an immediate danger to everyone that my mother's car was aflame right next to the gas station pump. The flames grew bigger and bigger. My sisters and I were in the station wagon, far back, and I was in the back seat. They leapt from the car as my mother commanded, "Get out now!" "Fire!" Her words were simple, but her tone said everything. Panic now and run. My reaction was not too fast, as I apparently did not grasp the gravity and the danger of the situation. Cynthia, my eldest sister, opened the back door and demanded I move now. I got out of the car and saw the flames now licking the ceiling of the gas station. Our station wagon was destroyed, with its engine blasting 10-foot flames into the air above a gas station pump, with smoke billowing everywhere. All but the station attendant fled to the street side as the station wagon burned and burned. The attendant had grabbed a fire extinguisher finally and was trying to extinguish the fire. He desperately hoped to put it out before it reached all the way into the fuel lines and the gas tanks, whereupon he did surmise it would explode and possibly ignite the huge gasoline tanks below that we stood. It was all insane. Our home was burned and destroyed for no reason other than bad luck and fate. Of course, the car was old, run down, and poorly maintained, so it was not entirely the hand of fate or the God-ran dam dealing a blow to us. No, it was the consequence of cutting corners on an old car. Just another risk you do when you are short on money. Whether the result of living in Mexico in unsanitary conditions or the consequence of poverty, my mother believed virtually all food was edible, regardless of how under or overcooked it was, or if it had been on the ground or coated with some dirt or filth. It didn't matter. My mother would demonstrate that fallen food was okay to eat by picking it up herself and shoving it into her mouth and chewing extensively and swallowing. She showed us by example that the food was edible and would not harm or kill you. After all, it did not hurt or kill her. Well, my mother had an iron stomach and developed remarkable resistance to bacteria and viruses, but not everyone else had her powerful immune system. In fact, people often became sick around my mother, though she never got sick. As an aside, my mother led an unsanitary lifestyle her entire life. Home, food, car, clothing. People would never know that my mother would end up a millionaire given her penny-pinching, never-spend-a-dime philosophy. I was a latchkey child, being left alone to fend for myself for most of my childhood. I would walk to and from school on prescribed routes with a house key attached to my pocket with a safety pin. There was a backup key under the sink in case I lost my key and needed one the next day. I never lost my key, however. It was standard for me to stay in the house and not go outside except to go to the backyard, and I was specifically never to go through any door or gate unless specifically told it was okay. That changed though as I grew older, of course, but as a toddler and later in kindergarten, those were the rules. There were other universal rules like do not touch or adjust the furnace, or the stove, or the oven. I understood my latchkey kid rules, and I complied with them. Of course, there were holes in the prescribed rules. I went into the backyard, as allowed, and promptly exited through a missing board in the fence in the back and played on the railroad tracks right behind the house. Fortunately, a neighbor saw a little toddler, me, playing alone on the train tracks and raced to my rescue from an eventual train-toddler collision. And whether the toddler hits the train or the train hits the toddler, it is going to be bad for the toddler. As a preschooler, my mother was renting a flop of a house, but the landlord expected any tenant, including my mother, to maintain the front and backyard lawn. That meant it had to be mowed, at least every few weeks. We were poor though, and we did not have a lawnmower of any kind. We didn't even have a push mower, much less a power mower. But the landlord insisted vehemently regardless that my mother had better find a way to take care of the lawn, or she would be evicted with us. My mother's answer was child labor. My sisters and I were assigned the jaw-dropping job of mowing the front and back yard. Little tiny kids mowing the yard. But what did we have? We had dull children's scissors to cut the grass. One blade at a time, I snipped that grass. Snip, 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 snip. You get the idea. The landlord dropped his demand, though, unexpectedly one day when he came to see how the landscaping was proceeding, and he saw 3 kids mowing the lawn with dull scissors, one grass blade at a time. I can only surmise as an adult that he felt so guilty seeing these enslaved children cutting the grass that he demanded be cut. Of course, I wonder if that was my mother's goal all along. To time our cutting the grass when the landlord arrived so he would witness the impact of his demands on these innocent victim kids. Conversely, my mother had no qualms either making us into child labor slaves for an insanely mundane, eternal task. Or she had no qualms in manipulating the landlord. Either way, in hindsight, I have to confess, I'm not impressed with how my mother, or the landlord, handled things. My mother fixed TVs and radios and observed common problems that people did to break their television sets, thereby justifying her job. They would use TVs as a table and spill drinks down into its interior, shorting its circuitry within. They would adjust cathode ray tube RGB guns in the back of the television to influence the TV's CRT, that's the cathode ray tube, magnetic forces and vertical and horizontal synchronization and analog signals from their antennas or cable converters. It was complicated, even for my mother, I think. People had no idea what they were doing, and they invariably put their televisions into states that they could not undo, and so they would call my mother to help them. Her business was the troubleshooter. She worked on fixing television sets. It was funny, kind of like the TV show Outer Limits. She would have to say to people, "Don't adjust the TV settings in the back. They have control of the vertical, of the horizontal." You get the idea. My mother learned to fix TVs and radios from her husband, my father, Silver. Throughout her working alongside Silver, she came to see his rage, though, over things not going the way he expected. Anytime things were problematic when he interacted with them, including customers, much less their repairs, went poorly. In one extreme incident, Silver was so frustrated with being unable to deduce what was wrong with a TV that he threw a hammer in his rage right through the front screen, and it shattered that cathode ray tube, the CRT, display. CRTs are highly pressurized, and so the impact caused an implosion boom, with the glass shards sucking into the television center, and then opposite the other side, like thousands of little glass razor shards, blasting in a circular 360-degree explosion. It was dangerous. The situation could easily have blinded anyone in range looking at the television. Apparently, Silver was determined to make his point that the TV was unfixable even after that. And so he made dang sure it was now unquestionably unfixable. He struck it again. As you can imagine, Silver made customers feel uncomfortable when he expressed rage. And he, even when was calm, was continuously fidgeting and staring intensely at people, as he may interact with them or even sat on the side. Silver was not a people person. Between his generating discomfort and his propensity for violent outbursts, my mother vowed to fix television sets going forward without him. My mother struggled to make ends meet repairing televisions. She branched to radios for people, but it still wasn't enough. She also learned that skill with Silver while they were on the run in Mexico. Like I said, she called herself the troubleshooter. That's an ironic name for my mother. Her journey in life was no cakewalk, although much of what she encountered were the consequences of her very poor decisions. It was an era when televisions had cathode ray tubes as their displays. Again, that's a CRT. It was a technology with a magnetic light that was bent to target to phosphorus screen surfaces with, again, magnets that swept row by row from bottom to top and left to right. I helped my mother fix TVs as a preschool kid at about 4 years old. It was my first job. Of course, my mother benefited from my labor. I was not paid, but it did keep me busy and out of her hair while she worked. So what did I do to help my mother as a 4-year-old? Well, I tested the analog tubes with a big tube tester box case. That meant you picked up little tubes that she pulled out of the TV and you plugged them into a matching socket, and if the little dial went up, it was good. If it didn't move, it was bad. It was somewhere in between. It would probably have a bad picture on the television. I also adjusted the TV set's embedded analog tuner controllers in the back of the TV to influence its horizontal and vertical synchronization. I also adjusted its signal processing to reduce poor picture snow. That were like dots that would kind of flash around your picture. I also adjusted the RGB guns to control scan line sweeps and the synchronization so that you would not have strange left and right tears on the display. I also adjusted the RGB mixers so that the red, green, and blue came out so they looked more correct, more natural. Old televisions needed a lot of work so they even looked okay. Helping fix televisions as a toddler exposed me to technology and pattern and number matching and debugging as a toddler and preschooler that no one, I think, maybe in the world normally does.